Ottoman were the leading country of Islamic countries, at least last periods, not the bankrupt, not destroying period, but when the Kanuni and Yavuz Sultan Selim and all those periods, they were leading, they were Caliph and leading. Do you think the affectations is coming till today? Do you think that there is some respect in other countries? When I have been in some Arabic countries, or they hide some ideas that the Ottoman or Turks now today, they are because for example now the president, they approach to the Arabic countries, they have good relations. So suddenly Arabic people remember something, or what's happening? Do you think all those leading period is some affectations comes today? Do you feel something, or?
Well, the lure of historical narrative will always be there. The common artistic, cultural traits are a constant reminder of the past we shared, that Arabs and Ottoman Turks shared. However, the contemporary period is a very complex, dynamic sphere that is different from these days past. So you have regional alliances now, you have regional powers at play. You have the Arab-Israeli conflict, and Turkey had to navigate a path within that conflict. You have an Arab Spring that spread to Syria, which with disastrous results because the president there just refused to relent to the will of the people and allow elections or step aside. And Turkey found itself a recipient of hundreds of thousands of refugees. And of course, all this, harkens to what could the Arab world learn from Turkey? How would Turkey navigate all these changes in the Middle East, given that cultural, connection of years past? And there is also the element of common religion, dominant religion at least, which is Islam. And Turkey's experiment with modernization and democracy and elections and stability. Of course, Turks are interested, apparently, and all indications point that they want stability in Egypt, they want stability in Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East. And they found themselves on the opposite side of the fence from Israeli policies, especially when it came to the siege of Gaza, as you know, and that ship which suffered 9 casualties who were killed by the Israelis simply for attempting to deliver humanitarian aid, unarmed people that is. So that kind of basically cemented Turkey's disposition from that conflict for a time at least. Although Turkey is a large, complicated country with needs that transcend a single event or incident. However, in the Arab world, you find a range of feelings about Turkey. Some would say we can draw lessons from the Turkish experience, especially in the case of Egypt, the oldest and the most established Arab country, the largest one to be sure, the most powerful, where democracy imploded. And from what I surmised following the news, the Turkish administration was not happy or encouraged with that collapse of an elected president who is now sitting in jail, who actually entered jail the same day that his despotic predecessor walked out of jail. So all of it came crashing down. And I'm sure that someone in the Middle East, myself included to be honest, points to the Turkish successes, although it is an ongoing process, modernization that is, as a way to draw lessons in Egypt and in Syria and elsewhere, so that religious currents can coexist with, modernist secular life in harmony, at least without violence.
Last question is, according to my last question, what was the reason that Ottoman Empire, of course there is no one reason of the social evils, but what was the bankrupting, how we call, destroying of the Ottoman?
Decline.
Decline, you say, I mean, disappear from the history. What was the reason?
The decline of the Ottoman Empire was the result of a long process, over 2 centuries almost. So you have a rise of influence and wealth in Europe, and bypassing the Ottoman Empire in terms of trading for spice and silk, and reaching the Far East by going around the Horn of Africa. So that signaled the decline, at least immediately, of the Mamluk dynasty, if you recall, in Egypt, as a matter of fact, which weakened to the degree that the Ottomans subdued the Mamluks and took their holdings in roughly 1517. But the Ottoman Empire, just when it expanded its realm, also faced a different global situation, whereby Europe is siphoning all kinds of wealth from the Americas, gold and silver. The Spanish Empire became the wealthiest empire in the world because of the amount of gold they were able to extract, using the locals as chattel labor in the Americas. So there was nowhere to go but to decline, although that decline was not a collapse as such. Rather, it was a very slow process of negotiating European rise of influence and wealth, whereby Europe made up its mind that the Islamic realm, the Muslim Turks, are the quintessential enemy, that they are the strategic enemy of the West. And it was a matter of time before Europe, which became wealthy and powerful, began to eye the Ottoman Empire because it stood in its path to its rich colonies in the East. That is, Europe began to eye the Ottoman Empire's position between Europe and the Far East, and therefore Palestine per se and Syria, which were part of the Ottoman Empire, were high on the list of the Europeans for conquest. And the Ottomans were powerful, and Europe did not find it easy to do that. But the pressure stayed constant on the Ottoman Empire, so that by the 17th century, 18th century, and certainly by the early 19th century, it was felt. And the first to go was Egypt, which became semi-autonomous. As a matter of fact, the governor of Egypt, who was appointed by the Ottomans, Mehmed Ali himself, launched a challenge against the Ottoman Empire itself. He sent his sons to Syria and marched almost to Konya. And that's when the Europeans intervened and basically destroyed his navy and the Ottoman navy in order to keep the status quo and dominate the area on their own terms. So Ottoman fights began, the Arab communities began to grumble, Europeans were gaining just too much wealth and power, and they were not going to relent until their pathway to the east, beginning with the Suez Canal, but also the domination of Syria and Palestine in order to connect the Mediterranean with the Arabian Gulf or the Persian Gulf, was accomplished. They were not going to stop until that happened. And it became a competition between Europeans themselves, the Russians, the French, and the British, until 1916, before the end of World War, 2 years into World War I, they sat down and they agreed on how to divide the holdings of the Ottoman Empire. So it was a rapid improvement in industrial output in Europe and the early industrial revolution, which basically sealed the fate of the Ottoman Empire, which fell in disrepair because that process of preparing future sultans became lax, and the palace services began to crumble. So that central government, for various reasons, lack of resources, length of period, began to give way to decay. At the same time, Europe was modernizing and embarking on an industrial revolution that basically made Europe eventually what it is today, a technological powerhouse. The last point that should be borne in mind is that none of this would have been possible, the Industrial Revolution, had it not been for the contributions of the Islamic dynasties to the sciences. All spheres of science that made the Industrial Revolution possible. That discussion is now absent from the discourse on the relationship between East and West.
No problem, please.
There is no question that Islam ended slavery as an institution, even before the message spread beyond the Arabian Peninsula, even beyond Mecca and Medina. As a matter of fact, the first martyrs in Islamic tradition were those who defended people who were enslaved. And there are many, many examples in Islam that drew attention to the fact that the Prophet and his teachings made sure that no human being should subjugate or own or abuse another based on difference of skin color. Hence, Bilal, who commanded, as a matter of fact, all Muslims of all colors to come to prayer. That was actually a message in that regard. So slavery as an institution ceased to exist with Islam, with the spread of Islam. Now, when Islam spread beyond the Arabian Peninsula, the custom was in antiquity, although we're talking about late antiquity here, but until this time, when two great nations fought, for example, the Zoroastrians, who were engaged in a global conflict with the Sassanids, that is, whose religion is Zoroastrianism, were engaged in a huge, very, very violent war with the Byzantine Empire, centered in Constantinople, today's Istanbul. And the custom was that when you subdue a town of, property of your enemy, you pillage, you kill the men, and you absorb the women and the children. That was the custom. So what Islam did when it spread to Syria, exactly where all that fighting was happening between East and West, as it were, at the time, between the Sassanid and the Byzantine empires, people found Islam a respite from years of conflict, some 200 years of conflict that dragged on and brought misery and high taxation and unspeakable violence in the population. So this is not to say that, for example, Muslims were invited to enter Jerusalem, and they made a point of, when Umar, the would-be caliph at the time, the general, entered the city, the Holy Sepulchre, he made sure to take his praying carpet and pray at a distance from the Holy Sepulchre, precisely to make sure that it is not turned into a mosque. Likewise, when Muslims spread into areas where Arabic-speaking and non-Arabic-speaking inhabitants lived, they basically did not practice that old custom of killing everyone or taking slaves. They gave Christians and Jews, as the people of the book, sanction, and they can remain as is. For the non-monotheists, they had a choice. You either become Muslim or you'll be put to the sword. Some of whom fled, some converted. So forward centuries after Islam, this habit of absorbing your enemy rather than killing them became practiced widely by the Buyids, by the Abbasid dynasty, and before them by the Umayyads. There has to be a clear distinction between this act of absorption of your enemies, including their young boys, for example, and bringing them into the fold of the religion, forcibly or otherwise, and slavery as such. That is not slavery, because the Mamluks, a word that means the people who are owned by someone else, gained a lot of experience in administration and warfare, and became rulers in Egypt, and their name remained Mamluks, the ones who were owned by remnants of the Abbasid dynasty. Yet they became the masters of the house in Baghdad itself, and also in Cairo. And if you can apply the same to the Ottoman Empire and beyond. Arabs and Muslims are often blamed for slavery because the Venetians had a huge appetite for abducting and smuggling slaves to Europe through the North Africa, through the Arab Middle East. And some historians blame Arabs for that, and many people, for political reasons, would take that out of context. So, were those people who were absorbed treated fairly all the time? Probably not. However, enough of them became themselves the new age of Muslims across the Balkans, for example. The Ottomans did the same thing. But in the Ottoman time, as is the case with in Persia and elsewhere, Islam was adopted to the local customs and traditions. So that practice became even more refined, whereby the Sultan would marry different women from different cultures and countries in order to bring those cultures together. That's why the early Ottomans made sure to marry women from Europe and expanded into Europe before they spread eastward, by the way, from the early beginnings in Bursa, near Istanbul, in Western Anatolia. So that practice can be looked at, the harem, for example, is also misunderstood for a subservient life of women who are, sexual objects. The reality is far from that. The mother of the most promising young boy was very powerful for a period when that process of educating the young and preparing them for leadership began to fall on hard times. The woman stepped up to the plate and actually ruled for a short period in Ottoman history. So those people who were absorbed from the Balkans and elsewhere, Albanians, you name it, stood a chance of becoming the backbone for the Ottoman fighting force. Some of the Sipahis were non-Turks. Arabs themselves were part of the Ottoman apparatus of their rule. But some actually ascended to become sultans themselves. So, in keeping with Islam, less attention was given to your racial orientation or ethnic orientation. In fact, Islam transcended all that and equated among people to a point that it ceased to become a strictly or exclusively Arab religion. It became the property of Turks who carried the banner of Islam for centuries. For 3 of them are glorious centuries where they reached the zenith of sophistication and in administration, in the sciences, in the arts, in all spheres of life. The same thing happened on the Eastern Front in Persia, where Muslims, Turkmen who became Muslims, also achieved a very high degree of refinement. So I think using the term slavery loosely is a misnomer for a very sophisticated, very complicated process of absorption, training, and for the purpose of spreading the word of Islam or maintaining a dynasty of sorts.